Hello, everyone. We are starting a new book called Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood by Gretchen, Sisson. This has been going, I would say, pretty viral on the child welfare talk, on TikTok. There is a slight author's note, and I do want to make that clear before we get started into our introduction. So let's read that first. With the exception of one participant who chose to be named, all names and identifying information throughout the book have been changed. Participant narratives have been edited for continuity, length, and to protect the privacy of individuals who were interviewed, but they otherwise reflect the stories of participants as they were told to me. Additional information on the research methodology is available in Appendix A. All right, we're going to get started right now in the introduction. In the winter of early 2009, 19-year-old Haley was adrift. Her parents had kicked her out of their house, and her 4-year-old son, Jacob, was temporarily staying with her sister. Haley was moving from couch to couch, staying with an aunt and some friends or her boyfriend, whom her parents hated. Haley had been adopted as a baby, but was in contact with her biological family. It was while she was staying with her birth mother that she began to suspect she might be pregnant again. She was correct. I was in the doctor's office right after they told me I was pregnant. Haley told me in 2010. I just wanted to get out of it, but I knew I couldn't handle an abortion. I thought adoption would fix everything. This first thought of adoption was fleeting. A few weeks later, Haley, still rootless, still single-parenting Jacob, still deeply uncomfortable with abortion, was determined to figure out how to raise her second child. I was going to keep him. I just knew I was going to keep him. That's how it was going to be. I was going to get a job, and I started going to school because I wasn't getting any jobs because I wasn't qualified for anything. I didn't need my parents, and I didn't need anyone else. Me and Jacob and the baby were going to make it. Haley was already familiar with this hustle. When she became pregnant with Jacob at 15, she was a below-average student, pregnant with uninvested in her schoolwork, but she was deeply motivated by becoming a mother to finish high school and provide a good example for her child. She immediately knuckled down and eventually graduated from high school with a 4.0 grade point average. Haley was proud of herself. She'd gotten herself together to parent Jacob. She could do it again for this baby. But a month later, Haley's determination was hitting a wall. It was now spring, and while the snow in the nearby Rocky Mountains remained deep, her suburban hometown was starting to thaw. She felt that the baby's father would be a danger to her and their child if she told him about the pregnancy, so she simply had not. Her parents, who had been so supportive after Jacob was born, told her that they didn't want to have anything to do with this baby. They said it was because the baby's father was dangerous, which Haley agreed he was. He had a history of being physically rough with her. But Haley thought it might also have been because the baby's father was black. Whatever their reasons for refusing to help, the result was the same. Haley's support network was thin, her bank account was empty, and her housing prospects were few. Okay, pausing there for a quick moment. We don't know if the true reasoning that they won't support her was because he was black, right? As parents, you should be supporting your child no matter what, right? No matter who they choose as their partner. Now, you may not agree with their partner, but you be there for them. However, often is the case that if someone is dating another person outside their race, right? Especially someone who is black, right? A white person, I'm assuming is Haley, is dating this black man. Too often, there's two things to this. Too often is that, one, the parents have these microaggressions. They may not think they're racist, but they are. And they won't support that, and they won't, it even seems that they're not really helping her with Jacob, although they said that they did a little bit, but they're really just showing their racist tendencies. On the flip side, Haley might have, and I say might have, right, dated this man, boy, whatever, we don't know his age, okay, so just making that clear. Because he is black and it's fighting against her parents' ideas, right? And I want to make it clear that this happens way too much. Instead of actually loving someone because of who they are. I'm not saying that we shouldn't see color, because that itself is racist. But understanding that if you are going to date someone who is not of the same race as you, right, that there are struggles that that person will go through because of, unfortunately, their phenotype, right? And we have to be aware of that, no matter how much we love that person, right? We have to be aware of that. You shouldn't date someone because your parents are racist and it's like, hey, I'm going to show them. You should date them because you are truly interested in that person and have a love for that person. Again, I'm not saying that is specifically Haley's case. I'm just saying this is often what happens, right? And then, of course, people are going to come and say like, oh, well, he's a black man, so of course he's aggressive. Again, that's a microaggression. Or, oh, she's a single mother. It figures, another microaggression with black men not being in the family. Again, completely untrue. We just have to be aware of those things, okay? Now, you may say, like, what does that have to do with adoption? All right, so here's where it has to do with adoption. In the history of adoption, specifically the black community, let me rephrase that. Specifically, only the white community more often had the finances, let me put it that way, to send their daughters, their unwed daughters, off, and then they would be forced to relinquish the child, right? If you guys remember, we read The Girls Who Went Away, and it talks about that. In other communities, like the black community, like the indigenous communities, like the Asian communities even, there is more of a kinship. Not always the case, but kinship also happens more often than not in those communities, right? It is a form of child welfare. It is still technically adoption, but there is more familial support, right? Instead of relinquishing a child to a stranger. So just throwing that out there. Continuing on. One night, Haley was parked outside a Safeway, making use of the store's free Wi-Fi to do her homework while Jacob slept in the back seat. I just suddenly burst into tears, she remembered. I just realized I couldn't take him. I couldn't take care of him. I think that's when I really knew adoption was right for Elijah, and not just my way of getting out of trouble. When when Haley relinquished her son Elijah for infant adoption, she joined a cohort of American women that is remarkably small. In recent years, only about 19,000 women have relinquished newborns annually, out of approximately 4 million births, and in the contrast to just under 1 million abortions. These rates mean that while over the course of their reproductive lives, nearly 86% of American women will give birth and 25% will have an abortion. Less than 1% will relinquish an infant for private adoption. Yet the discourse around adoption in our politics, in our popular culture, in how we think about family, building broadly, gives the decisions of these comparably few women an outsized role in American ideas about pregnancy, reproductive choice, and motherhood. However, these cultural narratives are centered on a politicized ideal of what motherhood and family ought to look like. They are almost never rooted in the lived experiences of people like Haley, a single teen mom who desperately wanted to find a way to parent and just couldn't make it work. Okay, again, she still, this example, right, of Haley, even though she was young, she is a prime example of someone who wanted to make things work and didn't have the resources. She didn't have the support system. She didn't have the finance. None of that, right? Even though she's trying. This is part of the problem. We need to have family preservation. We need better resources. I'm sure people are going to be like, oh, but there's, Medicaid and SNAP and blah, blah, blah. Look, yes, that's great. But that doesn't always help it. It's not always enough, and it usually takes a lot of time to get on it, right? That also doesn't answer the familial support. So keeping that in mind. Continuing on, in 2009, while Haley was grappling with what to do about her pregnancy, I was on the other side of the country working my way through graduate school. I was writing my master's thesis on infertility treatments, driving my zip car through Boston's suburbs to speak with couples about their struggles to conceive and build their hope for families. In between schoolwork, I spent my days interning at the Massachusetts Alliance on Teen Pregnancy, considering the rights and well-being of young mothers and their children across the Commonwealth. I spent my evenings volunteering with the Eastern Massachusetts Abortion Fund, taking calls from countless people who wanted an abortion but needed help affording one. And yes, abortions do cost money. I saw all these types of work as parallel critical efforts to understand and support people in having the families they wanted on their own terms. Just a few years earlier, in 2006, Ann Fessler's The Girls Who Went Away, The Hidden History of Women Who Surrendered Children for Adoption in the Decades Before Roe v. Wade had been published. Again, we do have that reading on here. You can go take a listen. I just was talking about that book. Opening the eyes of many in my academic and advocacy circles to the grim realities of adoption in decades past. In her book, Fessler probes the stories of women who not only lacked access to abortion, but also lacked sex education or knowledge about their own bodies and the means to make choices for themselves and their children. For these women, adoption was often coercive, always secretive, and unambiguously traumatizing. But in 2009, these haunting stories of pre-Roe adoptions seemed light years away as soon as you turned on the television. This was the same year that 16 and Pregnant began chronicling the lives of young mothers on MTV. The show's reality TV lens was, by the intention of the content creators, designed to present the lives of these young women as so disrupted and unappealing that other young people would go to any length to avoid early parenthood. The only exception to this portrayal in the first season was the story of Caitlin and Tyler, a teen couple who relinquished their daughter Carly for adoption. During the season finale, Caitlin and Tyler sat beside Dr. Drew Pinsky, who lauded them as courageous, strong, and extraordinary. I feel so passionately that you need to be honored, he gushed. Okay, I want to pause there. For those of you that follow or on TikTok and are on Adoptee Talk, you may know that Caitlin and Tyler have gotten into a lot of hot water. Well, not just over the years, but specifically with things that they did with stuff. And I've contemplated going back through 16 and Pregnant, specifically following their story and how they talked about adoption. And I'm going to say this, and I do feel passionately, I am disgusted by what they have done and what they said. There are a lot of things that they have said over the years from when it first aired to current day where they are just not trauma informed and they are really stuck in this mindset, right? And don't get me wrong, like they were taken full advantage of at a very young age, right? But the way that they treat the adoption, and it's just no respect to the adoptee, Carly, right? And I do, as a fellow adoptee, I want to give her respect. She is underage, and we shouldn't be telling her story. That is her story. I also want to say Dr. Drew Pinsky is not qualified to talk about adoption trauma. While he does teach psychology, he is an internal doctor. He deals with the insides and alcohol, right? He has no qualifications talking about adoption. And he is a problem himself. Okay, so yeah, gives me the icks to say the least. Anyway, we're going to continue. And of course, this cultural narrative praising adoption wasn't just on the MTV. The film Juno, portraying a spunky, sarcastic teen mother happily biking away after relinquishing her baby, was still fresh in moviegoers' memories, in contrast to a string of series finales punctuated by adoptions on Sex and the City and Friends, where viewers had been rooting for the adoptive parents all along. Juno felt novel by depicting a birth parent with any nuance at all. This was also the year that Sandra Bullock won an Academy Award for her role as a white savior adoptive mother in The Blind Side, a film in which the black birth mother is continuously villainized for not having the wisdom to give up her child. Okay, pausing there. First of all, The Blind Side was based off the true story of Michael Orr. He is not an adoptee. They didn't actually adopt him. It was a guardianship, and they tricked him into it. That's a whole other thing. I will eventually read his books with you guys, but white savior is the perfect word for this, right? And on that note, Colin Kaepernick, as much as he loves his adoptive parents, have said the same thing about his own parents. And the responses that people get the responses that people give towards Colin Kaepernick talking about his adoptive parents and his life experience as a Black adoptee in a white home is atrocious. Okay? Atrocious. It's just, he's not the only Black adoptee who has had the same sentiments, if not worse life experience. Let me be clear, it's not a competition, but there have been plenty of adoptees telling their stories and the horrific experiences that they have, gone through. And I guess it depends on the platform and who you are, because if you're Colin Kaepernick, it's really bad. But if you're someone else, it may not be nearly as bad. I'm not saying they don't still get comments that are similar, but they'll get maybe a little bit more support. I think that's important to note. Like, you're not alone in your life experience, right? We all have different life experiences, even as adoptees, right? We're not a monolith. But I think that's what's key here, is that we speak with each other, because at the end of the day, a lot of us have similar sentiments, similar feelings, despite how our adoptive parents are, right? Because of that adoption trauma, because of that maternal separation, because of the abandonment issues. So keep that in mind. All right. It was this cultural zeitgeist of adoption promotion that helped me understand the connections between my own work and the social conditions underlying infant relinquishment. The couples experiencing infertility, the marginalized young mothers, the hotline callers in need of money for their abortions. I saw them all as moving on parallel paths in creating the families that they wanted at the time in their lives. These paths were not mutually exclusive over the course of a lifetime, of course. Many women who became mothers have had previous abortions, and most people seeking abortions are already parenting children. But adoption puts these individual paths into intersection, with the promise that the path of this young mother or that woman struggling to afford an abortion should be part of the story of the couple trying to conceive. By transferring infants from poor, young, unprepared, or unsupported women to mostly married, often heterosexual, typical white families of financial means, private adoption is believed to avert the need for abortion, nullify purported adverse outcomes of teen parenting, alleviate the social burden for caring for under-resourced families, appease the pain of infertility, and uphold the value of the two-parent heteronormative family structure, or accommodate non-traditional families. In this common vision, adoption is a conservative panacea. It represents a particular effective private solution to myriad social problems. This context does not mean that adoption is embraced solely by the political right. In the decades since I began this project, American politics have changed dramatically, yet adoption remains one of the few bipartisan areas of political agreement. On the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, President Barack Obama framed adoption as mutual agreeable common ground in the abortion debate. A decade later, President Donald Trump would showcase a redemptive story about a nameless drug addict birth mother and the heroic police officer adoptive father in his State of the Union address. The March for Life's 2014 theme of Thank You, Birth Mom reflects the long-term investment of the anti-abortion movement in adoption promotion. While the inclusion of rights of adoptive parents in Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme case allowing gay marriage, reflects the reflects the ways many gay, lesbian, transgender, or queer people people use adoption as a means of family building. The Congressional Coalition on Adoption is the largest bipartisan bicameral caucus in the federal government, to the extent that adoption has been understood as a feminist issue. It has broadly been with the aim of upholding the practice of adoption and making it more widely accessible. Adoption makes possible the maintenance of both heteronormative family ideal beloved by the right and the non-traditional chosen family ideals embraced by the left. But all these ideals prioritize the families that are being created with little reliance on or accountability for the families that are separated. Okay, pausing there, I do want to make note, the Congressional Coalition on Adoption is probably one of the most problematic caucuses. And I say that because they refuse to listen to lived experiences of adoptees and birth parents, but will take on agencies and adoptive parents. They are getting the money, money talks, from these agencies. They're putting into their funds so that the laws continue to reflect and help the agencies. Meanwhile, there's only one state, right? We have 50 states in the United States. One state, which is New York, and it was only in 2020 that our human rights have been reinstored. Only in New York have our rights been reinstored. 49 states do not. We do not have the same access to important things in our vital records like kept people. And this is a huge issue. And of course, I'm arguing with hopeful adoptive parents and they're just not getting it. But that's the problem, right? They're so up in their mind, like, oh my God, I'm going to save a baby. Oh my God, we're going to build a family, not thinking about what's actually best for the child. And they don't like to listen to people like myself or other adoptees or other educators because we're going to burst that bubble. We're going to burst that motherfucking bubble. Excuse my language. Because the reality is that adoption should not be a family building tool. Now, don't get me wrong. Safe external care is necessary, okay? But it should be focusing on what is best for the adoptee. Not praising and uplifting and targeting those who want to build a family. The infertility community should not be targeted. The non-traditional families should not be targeted. No, frankly, nobody should be targeted in this, right? Except for having programs for family preservation when possible. And I want to make a note that if you ever decide to go look up the way that social programs work and the way that the adoption and the abortion rates are per president, not only do adoption rates go down, but so do abortion rates when we have more social programs. And it always happens under Democratic presidents. Now, that being said, like Gretchen was saying earlier, it is bipartisan. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Reagan, he was Republican. Trump, again, Republican. All of them, right, and these are just more recent years, all of them have had a say in adoption, right? So we got to make that clear. Okay. On June 24th, 2022, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization to overturn Roe v. Wade, the 1973 case that established a legal right to abortion across the country. The Dobbs decision thus allows the states to regulate and limit abortion provision, assuming the absence of federal law that protects abortion access. During the oral arguments for Dobbs in December 2021, the questions the Supreme Court justices asked did little to probe what the burden would be for American women who were denied abortion access, what it would mean for their physical and mental health, their families, their futures, their communities. Instead, given the opportunity to reverse 53 years of constitutionally protected access to abortion, many questions centered on adoption. Justice Amy Coney Barrett asked if all these potential burdens could have averted if more women terminated their parental rights after giving birth. Essentially, isn't adoption the solution? Okay, pausing there, I want to mention that Justice Amy Coney Barrett is an adoptive mom. I don't know if a lot of you know that she is an adoptive mom. She's also very conservative and very religious. Thus lies the problem. There is biases, lots of it. And no, adoption is not the solution. Not only should women have access to abortion, right? No, let me make this clear. Not only should women have the choice to have that decision, right, without worrying about being prosecuted, but also have access to abortion. Because just because some states are, you could choose, doesn't mean that there's actual access. And sometimes that's really hard to get. Then we have states that are prosecuting, that are allowing women to die because they medically cannot get an abortion, despite everything. Women are suffering. And it's all because the money is going into these pockets, right? And yes, justices can take gifts. They can. We've seen it. They're technically supposed to report it, although there's no oversight in that, or not much, right? Anyway, history has already answered the question and told us definitely that no, it's not. But the traumatized voices of pre-Roe birth mothers seems distant. Fessler's Girls Who Went Away are now a generation or more removed. Okay, but despite that is still happening. Not on the same extent that it was pre-Roe versus Wade, there are still these homes. And it's mainly in very religious areas like Utah. So just want to keep that in mind. The practices of adoption today seem different enough that it is plausible to convince ourselves that we are not doomed to repeat those traumas. But even if the stories of birth mothers today do not precisely repeat the history of pre-Roe counterparts, they still echo the stories of earlier generations. The reversal of Roe versus Wade will deny some Americans access to abortions that they would otherwise choose to have, potentially drastically increasing the number of domestic adoptions. This will not be because women frequently decide between abortion and adoption, as this book will explore. They do not. But because as people's options are constrained, as abortion is unavailable, and parenting is untenable, adoption becomes the only path forward. If we wish to understand what adoption means today, we must listen to Relinquishing Mothers Now. Relinquished provides a comprehensive account of their stories, what their life was like during pregnancies, how they come to decide on adoption, and what consequences adoption has had for their lives and their children. The stories that I have collected over the last decade illuminate what types of motherhood, which children and whose families are most valued by our society, and how individual life trajectories are shaped when looming forces of abortion politics, religion, conservative family values, and non-traditional family building intersect to create narratives about adoption that are not rooted in the experiences of those who live it. This book seeks to correct this error by recentering the experiences of Haley and so many women like her. The failure to listen to their stories means continuing to misunderstand the complexity of modern adoption and to misalign our public policy with the needs of those most impacted. Most important, neglecting the stories of women who relinquish infants will mean we fail to understand what happens when women are not in control of their own reproductive lives and futures, and when families are not supported at a very basic level. It will mean carrying the injustices and traumas forward for new post-Roe generation and beyond. This book is the result of over 100 interviews with women who have relinquished infants for domestic adoption. In 2010, I met with women across the country, from a living room with a panoramic windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean to the conference room of a law firm, the lobby of a quiet Quaker meeting house, a bench outside of a sandwich shop that had no empty tables, a pizza parlor in Massachusetts, and a Starbucks in Texas, which required my transcriptionist to strain to hear the conversation over the sound of the coffee grinder. In 2020, I met with women over Zoom as we are all socially distanced inside our homes during the COVID-19 pandemic. While I interviewed mothers who relinquished as early as 1962, this book focuses on women whose adoptions took place between 2000 and 2020. They live in every region of the United States. At the time of our interviews, these women were lawyers, stay-at-home mothers, college students, psychologists, teachers, an acupuncturist, a sex worker, a professor, a hairstylist, a grocery store cashier, and a photographer. Several were unemployed, a few were formerly incarcerated, some were formerly homeless, and a few others had histories of addiction. Many were religious, some used to be but weren't anymore, and a few had never been. Many were married or remarried, newly divorced, or avowedly single. One had just broken up with her boyfriend and was hoping it would stick. Several of them were adopted themselves, which impacted how they understood their pregnancies and relinquishments. Most of them were raising children. In short, they represented the full range of American life. Their paths had led them to adoption at one point, one way or another. But they were often on different trajectories. They had a tremendous range of experiences and feelings around their relinquishments. In the context of the sweeping history of family separation and adoption in the United States, this book offers a close examination of just 21-year period of just one 20-year period from the perspective of mothers who relinquished infants for private domestic adoption. My participants terminated their parental rights by signing adoption paperwork, and their children were adopted privately through adoption agencies and independent attorneys. Their rights were not terminated by the state, aka through foster care, and their children, for the most part, were not placed in foster care. Accordingly, I do not speak to the experiences of families targeted by the family regulation system, aka foster care, unless they also engage with private adoption. However, as we will see, the presence of such threatening systems does shape the experience of many mothers, particularly women of color. This book focuses solely on domestic adoption and the experiences of American mothers. I do not examine the way international relinquishment is structured within the political systems of other countries, nor does my sample include relinquishing fathers. While I interviewed a few fathers, I ultimately did not include them in this analysis. Birth fathers remain under-considered in the ways adoption is practiced and understood. Finally, and most critically, I do not study the experiences of adopted people, although I do consider other research that has examined the impact of adoption on their lives and work to incorporate their voices wherever possible. Ultimately, my research provides one meaningful piece in the large and complex puzzle that is American adoption. The stories shared in this book are not about faraway people. While the families formed by adoption are often visible to us, the families separated by adoption are often unseen. As I interview these mothers, I found that their lives, and the lives of many other women like them, intersected with my own. 2 participants took classes at the same small college I attended with the same professors. Several women worked with the adoption agency professionals that I had met at conferences for work. One had, years ago at the time of her adoption, lived just down the street from my house where I was then, working interviewing her over the phone. Another participant, Natalie, lived several states away. However, her daughter had been adopted by a couple in San Francisco, where I lived with my children, including my son, who was about the same age as her relinquished daughter. The adoptive parents had given their daughter a distinctive name. One sunny Saturday, while attending my son's soccer game, I heard that name called out on an adjacent playing field, and I knew from the details Natalie had shared with me that I was watching her daughter dribble the ball toward the goal, surrounded by her classmates. The fact that Natalie had not seen her child in years, while I now sat yards away from her, made Natalie's separation feel all the sharper. The cultural erasure of families separated by adoption often makes these stories invisible, but they are often right in front of us. My analysis and curation of these stories is rooted in my perspective as a feminist scholar who values autonomy and care in the pursuit of reproductive justice. In this effort, I am indebted to the women of color theorists who have articulated reproductive justice as a critical feminist theory. The women of color activists who have built the reproductive justice movement and the impacted people, not just my participants, but the myriad scholars, writers, and advocates, particularly transracially and transnationally adopted people, who have shaped the connections between adoption and reproductive justice in their work, many of whom are cited throughout this book. This book represents my effort to preserve the accounts of my participants and contribute to this collective production of knowledge. While I did not set out to write a polemic, my commitment to listening to the voices of relinquishing mothers and adopted people and my belief in reproductive justice as the best way forward in our post-Dobbs world have both led me to understand the current practices of domestic infant adoption in the United States as the anthemia to the pursuit of justice. When I first spoke with Haley, it was just over a year since her second son, Elijah, was born. She had initially wanted a semi-open adoption, which for her meant exchanging pictures and updates and having occasional visits. But the agency she worked with gave her a profile for prospective adoptive parents. Rachel and Mark and Haley was immediately drawn to them. Rachel and Mark wanted a fully open adoption, having learned that research supported the idea that openness was better for the adopted child. Haley agreed. I couldn't handle not ever hearing from Rachel and Mark again. It wasn't just because of Elijah. It was because of them. I just really love them. I couldn't really imagine not having them part of my life. Rachel is practically a sister to me now. I definitely consider them part of my family. I think they consider me part of theirs. I talk to Rachel pretty much every day, and it's not always about Elijah. I think she cares about me too. Haley seemed satisfied with where she was in life. She felt that adoption helped her gain the respect of her parents, which she never really had. When we spoke, she'd just become a certified nursing assistant and was about to begin a new job that paid $11 an hour, more money than she'd ever made. She couldn't yet hold Elijah without crying, but she loved that Rachel never put him down. I couldn't do that if I kept him, she said. I'd have to be working, and most likely it would have to be 2 jobs. I wouldn't have time to not put him down. Haley was excited that Rachel, Mark, and Elijah had moved much closer to where she lived, just an hour away, and was hopeful that she'd see them often. In many ways, this was a successful adoption narrative, and Haley's story seemed to confirm our best ideas about what adoption today could be. Rachel and Mark cared about Haley, and they were so committed to open adoption that they pushed for it when Haley was initially reluctant. Haley, the young woman who was so alone during her pregnancy, felt the support and friendship of her son's adoptive mother. Elijah was loved and healthy in a stable family. Haley felt respected by her parents and it had achieved an educational goal and was eagerly on a path toward financial self-sufficiency. If Haley's feelings about her own adoption were unexplored, if it seemed that Haley needed Rachel's friendship in an asymmetrical way, if that Haley's inability to hold Elijah without crying was mentioned just passingly, and if there was an implied question mark lingering in Haley's voice when she talked about being part of Rachel and Mark's family, surely the foundation was strong enough to weather all that for a lifetime. It would take 10 years and hundreds of interviews with women like Haley for me to understand why it wasn't. Okay, so I want to pause there before we end the video. So when Haley was interviewed, the relinquishment was still fairly new, right? They're just within a year. Unfortunately, majority of adoptions, open adoptions with their PACA agreements, which is post-adoption contact agreement, end before the age of 5. And that is because in majority of states, that contract is not legally binding. Yeah. So hopefully, here's my hopefully, Haley, Rachel, and Mark continue to keep this openness. And I think that it's great that Rachel and Mark moved closer to her and for them to have more contact, right? In the best interest of of baby Elijah. I do think that it's absolutely necessary for Haley and for any birth mom to go through therapy. I also think it's in the best interest of Elijah for adoptive parents to go through infertility therapy if they're dealing with that, and family therapy. And to have an adoption competent therapist for the adoptee. And I say this as someone who not only has had, as a child, an adoption competent therapist, has an adoption competent therapist now as an adult, but also had an open adoption that lasted past the age of 5. Okay. And when I was reading how Haley was talking about Rachel and Mark, it reminded me of all of the letters that I have from my own birth mom and my parents' responses to her and their friendship and the way that they each talk about each other, right? never putting either one down, right? My birth mom uplifts my adoptive parents uplift my birth mom, and all of them, tried their best to be trauma informed for the sake of me. Now, I am very privileged in that. I know that, which is why I'm coming to you guys, because my story is unfortunately uncommon. That doesn't mean that there aren't similar stories out there. It just means it's not the majority, right? And if adoption is going to continue, we have to be trauma informed. I'm also going to say, I really think that any adult that is going to be interacting with the adoption community, whether that's a babysitter, a nanny, teachers, doctors, etc., should be trauma informed on adoption. That is my 2 cents. Anyway, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll be back tomorrow for chapter 1, or part of chapter 1.